In 2008, I got a chance to work with a program in South Korea that dealt with North Korean refugees, escapees coming out there, and many of them want to come back to South Korea because that's where their family is. But working with those people, they helped them integrate back into society. They were considered in many ways outcasts. They didn't know how to bank. They didn't know about cell phones and foods. Picture yourself living back in 1950 in this time bubble, and all of a sudden you get out and you're in the 2000s, and life has changed. And so because they didn't know how to use the system, sometimes it was abused, and they just became social outcasts. They were just kind of shunned. And so here was this group that I came into and kind of walked into this room. And I remember looking at the people, and all their eyes just became like saucers. You see, they had never seen an American, much less a white guy. They'd been told from their North Korean leaders that Americans were devils and they'd eat your liver. You know, don't recommend that. But I walked into this room, and it was a little girl, a 5-year-old, probably little girl about that age, that came up and started breaking the ice. She wanted to play cards with me. Kids are pure, curious. And then, of course, her mom came around and probably wanting to protect her daughter from the devil liver eater guy. So she came around, and they had asked me, would you come and just share with this group of 30 people in this classroom? And it was on the spot, and so I prayed and said, Lord, what am I going to share? And he gave me this account here that we're going to look at today, the story of Zacchaeus, a social outcast that was welcomed by Christ. And as I shared this story, the eyes began to be filled with, tears rather than fear. It was tears of realizing the love of Christ for them personally, and their connection. And by the end, it was such a joyous occasion, and the walls were broken down, and it was definitely the love of Christ winning out over sinful ideologies. The point is this morning is that God's love for me and you is greater than our sins. It's greater than the social stigmas we may carry around with us, whether it's from society or others around us. And what we see today in Luke chapter 19 illustrates that very well. Jesus is in his last week. He's coming down to his last week on earth. He's making his way to Jerusalem where he will be crucified. He will be hailed as king on Sunday and crucified on Friday, and he comes through this city of Jericho. Follow along with me, chapter 19, verse 1. Then Jesus entered, and passing through Jericho, now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he was of short stature. So he ran ahead and climbed into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. We can stop right there for a moment. The man's name is Zacchaeus. It means pure one. Of course, he wasn't a pure one. He wasn't in verse 2, but he will be by the time of verse 10, those of you that know this account. But we read there in verse 2 that he was a chief tax collector, which means that he was not just a tax collector, but he was over other tax collectors. Rome had issued that the taxes needed to be collected, and so people would collect those taxes. But Rome never said, you can't take more, and they didn't even look into it. So a tax collector at that day would kind of tack on more to the price of taxes to kind of fill his purse, so to speak. And as a result, they became very hated, especially the Jews who became tax collectors. They were considered traitors. It was a life of selfishness, of greediness, of just, really just debauched living. John the Baptist had said, when they came to him and said, what must we do? He said, collect no more taxes than what you should. And so he said, be fair. But of course they weren't. That was this man's lifestyle. He had a powerful position. He had many possessions. It says that he was rich there in verse 2, which he had incredible wealth. And probably had the newest 30 AD sport utility donkey with food injection, and he's got his Air Jews on, and he probably lives in, Jericho Hills 90210 type of thing, and he's got all that, but he's empty, absolutely empty inside, because we see how this all plays out. And many people know that route. Possessions never replace the hole in our heart that we have for the Lord. But Zacchaeus had probably heard the story of Jesus' ministry over 3 years, and now He's there at his job. He's working his regular day, and I'm sure somebody comes running by, hey, Jesus is coming, Jesus is coming. And so he goes, man, this is the opportunity, closes shop, and kind of heads out to get a look and possibly some interaction with this one that was captivating. And he ran into two obstacles. The first was the size of the crowd, which he couldn't control. And obviously the second he couldn't control either was his own size, his short stature. It says there in verse 3. He was a wee little man. And in the Scottish version it says that. But he was very short of stature. There's hope for you that are, what do they call it, vertically challenged. Those of you that are vertically challenged, there's hope. I kind of picture him as kind of like the Danny DeVito type. Danny DeVito's only 4 foot 10 inches tall. And so I kind of look at Danny DeVito and go, that's a Zacchaeus right there, that about in person there. But what I find interesting as I was looking through this is that you realize that there will always be something in the way between you and Jesus. You've got to figure out a way to get through it, to get to him. Sometimes it's people. It's family, coworkers, neighbors. Sometimes it's positions. Well, this is my job, my career. If I actually claim to be a Christian here, what would happen? I might lose my influence. People would mock me. Maybe it's the possessions. Well, if I followed him, what would I have to give up? And I don't know about that. Or maybe it's just simply your own pride. Things are going to get in the way. And we have to decide, is the problem too big that I would just stop in my tracks, turn around, and go home? Or do I press in? And when I press in, maybe along that way, we find a great blessing. See, here's the blessing in it. Zach, we'll call him, found a way past the obstacles he faced to get to Jesus. How? By going further and going higher. It says there very clearly in verse 4 that he ran ahead and he climbed into a sycamore tree. Let me show you a picture of a sycamore tree, those of you that aren't familiar with them. This is one in Jericho. Of course, they kind of fenced it off and said, hey, this is probably the one that he climbed. Quite a climber, but they're very low branch trees that you could climb up into. And you see, all he saw before heading into the tree, all he saw was backsides and kneecaps. He's only way little tall. And that's what his life was. It was shunned. People just pushed him aside, ignored him. But he knew that when I went ahead and went higher, that I would catch a vision of who he is, who Jesus is. And I would tell you the same thing. The obstacles in your way are opportunities to exercise faith, to go further, go higher, and see things from God's perspective. And that's what happened here. He climbs up in the tree, and there he would visually get a change. There he would probably see some bald spots and realize, hey, these people aren't perfect either. There he would see things and catch a view that he hadn't had before. And there in the tree, things would change for him, as we're going to find out. But the picture is even bigger. The picture is the tree that you and I go to, not climbing up, but kneeling down before to get a real view of who Jesus is, the tree of the cross. And that's the gospel in the midst of all this. When you get to that place, that is where things begin to change and the life is rearranged. Verse 5, he says there, and when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And what I love about Jesus is that he recognized him first. He didn't ignore him. He looked up at him. And I would tell you that any effort made towards Jesus, no matter how small, the Lord sees it. It catches his eye. Whether you're digging through a roof to let down your friend, Jesus noted it. Whether you're pressing through a crowd to touch a robe, Jesus noted it. Whatever your situation, those steps, he notes, he sees. You may be in a pit of just despair or depression. The Lord sees that. He can reach you. You may be in a hole of just anger and bitterness. That's no problem for God. You may be in a place of just captivated in sin. You know that the Lord is capable. He sees you right where you're at. Not with eyes of judgment, but with eyes of love. For now Jesus calls him by name, Zacchaeus, reminding him of the purity that he can do. You see, you're not a number to God, you're a name. The tone here is not like your mama used to say to you when she said your three names, Zacchaeus, John, Davidson, you better get out of that tree. You're causing problems. You're going to hurt yourself. Whatever it is, you have your own stories. You know when your parents were upset with you. It wasn't one name. It wasn't two names. It was all three names. And the Lord just says, Zacchaeus, out of gentleness, as if the Creator is saying, I see you. I know you. People may hate you, may have turned you away, but I still love you. And he calls him by name, and then he requested him, today I must stay at your house. And understand that in the Middle Eastern culture, it was normal to actually invite yourself over to somebody's house. It was actually an honored thing. In our culture, we go, you ain't coming to my house. It ain't clean, right? And so, how about we meet at McDonald's down the road and we can have a chat? That's just how we operate. But back in that culture, it's like, hey, you coming to my house? Perfect. Let's do this. This is great. What an honor. And I love that this is the heart of Jesus. He comes to each one of us and says, hey, would you open the door of your heart? Today I want to be in your house. Revelation says, behold, I stand at the door and I knock, and if any man would hear my voice and open the door, I will come into him and we will have that meal. We will dine together, and fellowship is one. It says this in John 14, if anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. It's a heavenly invite, but each of us must respond to it. Well, how did Zach respond? Look at verse 6. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. But when they saw it, they all complained, saying, he has gone to be a guest with a man who is a sinner. Then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, look, Lord, I give half of my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. Zacchaeus' response in verse 6 and 8 is of obedience and joy. He's just absolutely thrilled that Jesus would consider him, of all people, to say, hey, I want to go to your house. And he opens the door, he runs down the tree, and just is enthralled with this whole thing. Somewhere along the line, I'm sure Jesus shared the gospel as we see the change taking place. But not all are happy. As Zacchaeus leans into Jesus, the crowds lean away from him. In verse 7, they're complaining. The shocker to the crowd is not that, oh my goodness, I can't believe he invited himself into someone's house. It was that he would go to that guy. And how true it is that the self-righteous will always complain against God's heart and his actions towards the lost and the hurting people. Maybe it's pride that gets in the way that says, well, you know what, I've worked hard and I've gone to church my whole life and I know all these things and I deserve that aspect of grace. That guy doesn't deserve it. Maybe it's pride. Maybe it's legalism. Well, I've towed the line and I've obeyed all the rules, and so I deserve that, not them. And until they actually follow the same footsteps I did, then I'll accept that they're actually worthy of Jesus. Maybe it's simply fear. If I go and I spend time with them, what are all my friends going to think? What's the religious world going to think? Ooh, I can't do that. All those things get in the way. Whatever it is, it's sin. But what I love about Jesus is he came to seek and save that which was lost. And look at how he views people. Luke chapter 5, 31 and 32. Jesus answered and said to them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. Jesus went to the home of a sinner in verse 6, and obviously when Zacchaeus came out, he was a saved man. But the mission is there, the heart for the lost. And the evidence is quite clear in verse 8. He's willing to give half of my goods to the poor. He's a giver. 20% was considered pious in the Jewish eyes. This guy gives half. Maybe that's the amount he was taking on top of the Roman tax. But he's a giver. Jesus said it's harder for a rich man to get into the kingdom of God than for a rich man to go through an eye of a needle. And you Bible scholars would note that in chapter 18, a rich man came to Jesus, and Jesus said, sell off everything you have, and he went away sorrowful. But in chapter 19, another rich man comes to Jesus, and he gives out everything he has, and there's salvation. With God, nothing is impossible. So he's willing to give, but he's not only willing to give, you notice he's also willing to restore. It says there in verse 8, if I have taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. According to Exodus 22, verse 1, it was a thief's restoration, fourfold. This is a man that has had a confrontation with Jesus that has captured his heart in a way like never before. And he says, I want to live absolutely different than I had before. I am putting all that behind, and there is evidence in his life. He wants to give. It's not self-oriented. He wants to restore. He wants to renew. He wants to go forward. because of Jesus' love for him. It's a powerful, powerful picture. G. Campbell Morgan said this: Zacchaeus went into his house mastered by the passion to get, and he came out swept by a compassion that gives. Something happened inside that house as a result of time with Jesus. And truly, the time that you spend with Jesus, something does happen. It's called salvation. And the gospel does that. How would Jesus respond? Well, in verse 9 and 10, he just simply says this: today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. You see, salvation is a today invitation, not a tomorrow consideration. God is always working within the today. The enemy in the world says, procrastinate. Procrastinate, put it off. When you're older, somewhere down the road, you'll get to it. While the world and the enemy say procrastinate, God says activate. Today is the day. Activate faith and be saved. Paul wrote this way in 2 Corinthians 6. He says, we then, as workers together with him, also plead with you not to receive the grace of God in vain. For he says, in an acceptable time I have heard you, and in the day of salvation I have helped you. Behold, now is the accepted time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. And I would reiterate that the Lord accepts you and wants to change you, that now is the day of salvation, to surrender your heart to Jesus. And those who do have this promise, just like Jesus gave Zacchaeus here, you are a son of Abraham. He not only was a son physically, but he was a son spiritually. Because Galatians 3:7 tells us, therefore, know that only those who are of faith are sons of Abraham. That there he would be a brand new person. And Jesus took Zacchaeus' life as he was and changed him from the inside out. And God does the same thing with you and I. We read this in 2 Peter, or 1 Peter chapter 2. But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but are now the people of God, who have not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. You see, Jesus' mission to every single one of us is really simple: to seek and save that which was lost. No one is too far gone. And there have been a lot of hoopla in the news lately, in regards to Kanye West. Kanye West, I believe personally, is just like a Zacchaeus. He's in this situation. Those of you that aren't familiar with it, in particular with Kanye, he's been doing these Sunday service events recently all over America, and just making an incredible impact among people who aren't churched. It's actually drawing thousands to do church in an unconventional way. In an interview, he said this. He said, now that I'm in service to Christ, my job is to spread the gospel, to let people know what Jesus has done for me. I've spread a lot of things. There was a time I was letting you know what high fashion had done for me. I was letting you know what the Hennessy had done for me. But now I'm letting you know what Jesus has done for me. And in that, I'm no longer a slave. I'm a son now, a son of God. I'm free. And last week, he put out a new album, which was called Jesus is King. And I've listened to parts of it and such, and it's interesting. It's not my style of music, but I'll say it's interesting, and that's the freedom we all have. But here he put his whole career on the line in the stance for Christ. He was interviewed on Jimmy Kimmel, and in the interview he said, are you now a Christian musician? And his response was, I'm a Christian everything. And I think that is really, really key. But some have sat back, and the world has sat back and questioned, this is a mental thing going on. I imagine they did the same thing with Zacchaeus. Some have sat back and questioned, even from the religious aspect of, is this really true? It can't be true, and such. And instead of rejecting it, I would encourage you to rejoice in it for 3 reasons. Number 1, because the message of Jesus is being talked about. Whether you know Christ or not, Jesus is coming into the picture in conversations. And Paul would write in Philippians 1, he says, I don't care how it comes about, people are talking about Jesus, and I'm excited about that. Whether their motive is wrong or whatever. Number 2, God's always in the business of saving sinners, even celebrity sinners. Are they have a harder time? Yeah, in some ways, yes. But God is always into saving sinners, and we should rejoice when sinners make that step. Who am I to say who he can and cannot save? I think about the beginnings of the church, and the church, actually was at a place of fear when Paul got saved because he had really done them a lot of harm. And in time, they began to embrace him, and God used Paul in a mighty way. And who's to say what God's going to do through this life? But the church's responsibility is to rejoice in the initial salvation and then pray for discipleship and growth to maturity in that person's life, wherever their background may be. That they would become more like Jesus. It's not about becoming more like me. It's not my preferences. It's not I look and critique somebody's life to say, oh my goodness, they said a bad word. They can't be a Christian. Come on, man. There's a point where we say, you know what? When we all got saved, we were all rough around the edges, and the grace of God changes us over time and matures us in him. So we want grace because we give grace, and we give it out. And lastly, that God's given him a platform that we don't have to reach people I could never reach. You have a platform too. You have a platform at your job and in your family and in your neighborhood and whatever influences you have. Zacchaeus had a platform with all of his rich relatives or friends that were in that tax collecting business or whatever. He could share what God had done in his life personally with all these people that the average person couldn't reach. And use that platform. Use it to promote Jesus. Kanye said, God is showing off through me. And I thought that was interesting because the question then becomes to each of us is, how is God showing off in you and in me? That's what we want. Zacchaeus had a radical conversion with immediate evidence as he's giving his life away and giving to restore and renew. And in much the same way, like Zacchaeus, we find Kanye doing the same things. And I think that what the church needs to do is to just rejoice in it and support it, to believe that God can do great things through people, and to watch and see how the Lord works. Pray for him. Pray for him. Not to have the critical eye like the crowd did, going, I can't believe that person, that can't be saved. Jesus can save whoever he wants, and he does. You may be a Zacchaeus, despised and rejected by society, self-imploding, trying to wrap your world in all that you have and own, but there's emptiness inside. I'll tell you what, Jesus comes wherever you're at. He calls you by name. Says, I want to come into your house and I want to rearrange and change your life. And those who accept him by faith say, Lord, save me. You've watched God do amazing things through them. I can't wait to get to heaven and meet the wee little man. Maybe he grew. No. Growth spurt. But I'm sure he's going to share the stories with you and I of what happened after the fact, because of the power and the work of the gospel message in his own life.